The fight between Gojo and Sukuna has been pushed to new limits. Gojo and Sukuna are now locked in a slugfest to bring the fight between the strongest to round 2, as both of them have been pushed to a point where they can no longer use their domains. All of this starts with the battle of domain expansions that they've been having since the fight began.
Infinite void.
Gojo's biggest goal in the fight against Sukuna has been landing Unlimited Void. Shoko points out that in the fight against Sukuna, that if his Unlimited Void lands, then Gojo will win. Even Gojo's Hollow Purple pushed to 200% wasn't enough to kill Sukuna, so landing Unlimited Void is the best way for Gojo to take Sukuna down for good. After sending Sukuna flying, Gojo gets ready to clash domains with Sukuna again. Both Gojo and Sukuna then use their respective hand signs to cast their domains, making this the 5th time in a row that each of their domain expansions have been used. Gojo then uses the much smaller version of his domain that he developed mid-fight, and the 5th clash of domains begins. But Yuta Kotsu notices that something is different about this domain clash compared to the others. Gojo expanded his domain expansion an instant earlier by a 1/10 of a second. Sukuna, using a reverse curse technique to heal himself, made him late in reacting to Gojo, leading to Gojo being quicker than Sukuna and giving him the edge in the end. Gojo is shown being highly intelligent in this encounter, as he's played his fight with Sukuna extremely well. Gojo credits the reason for him beating Sukuna's domain expansion to Sukuna being too busy with healing his body to restore his curse technique in time. Gojo, being completely aware of the burnout caused by a domain expansion, ripped off a piece of Sukuna's face with one of his attacks, forcing him to heal both his body and then his technique in a very small amount of time, showing that Gojo put as much pressure on Sukuna as possible to give himself an advantage, which paid off over time. Gojo then lands Unlimited Void on Sukuna. This sends infinite sets of information into Sukuna's brain that never ends, something that caused Sukuna to start bleeding from the mouth as his mind starts to be fried. Gojo then sees that his attack was successful and lunges at the opportunity. Going after Sukuna, Gojo says that he's not done yet. What he has for Sukuna isn't finished, saying that crushing Sukuna's heart was the bare minimum. He wants his lungs and liver too, aiming to bring him even closer to death than Yuji at the detention center. This highlights Gojo having no problem with killing Sukuna, even with him being in Megami's body, since Sukuna already died in Yuji's body before, showing that Gojo is using everything that he has to take Sukuna down, with no exceptions. Before Gojo can reach Sukuna, Mahoraga's wheel begins to turn, signaling the summoning of the strongest Shikigami of all time. Sukuna then summons Mahoraga inside of Unlimited Void to counter Gojo's domain. Mahoraga being the Shikigami that Megami once thought was strong enough to kill Gojo on its own, presenting a new challenge for Gojo that he would have to overcome. Still in shock that Mahoraga has been summoned, Gojo readies himself to kill Mahoraga. Mahoraga then shatters Unlimited Void, destroying Gojo's domain expansion from the inside out, showing that despite Gojo's initial confusion, Mahoraga had in fact adapted to Unlimited Void, shattering Gojo's domain expansion and breaking the balance of the fight. Mahoraga is the strongest Shikigami of the 10 Shadows that's been untamed as long as the technique's been around. It's a Shikigami that's noted as being able to adapt to any and all phenomena, like a late throw in rock, paper, scissors. This means that Mahoraga is able to adapt to any attack that it's hit by a single time, as long as it survives and the wheel on its back turns, making any attacks that fit into the same category ineffective and killing it off completely. This stops many characters in the series from being able to do anything against Mahoraga, which is why it's known as the crown jewel of the Zenin family. Back to Gojo and Sukuna. Sukuna is now completely free from Gojo's domain expansion and back in the real world, recovering his injuries with reverse curse technique, which is evident by the smoke around his body. This would normally be an issue for many who use reverse curse technique in the series, as the massive cost of using it chips away at the user's curse energy supply. Although Sukuna has such massive curse energy reserves and high efficiency with using it that his limits are still unknown. Mahoraga, as a side note, is massive, so massive that he makes both Gojo and Sukuna look small by comparison. Mahoraga can be seen clearly towering over Sukuna, and the difference between both of them is huge, even when Mahoraga is crouching down. Megami, whose body Sukuna's using, is said to be 5'9" or 175 centimeters, with Sukuna only coming up to Mahoraga's waist when he's not even standing upright. Mahoraga is a titan of a Shikigami, who may even be twice as tall, if not more than that, than both Gojo and Sukuna separately. While Mahoraga would usually be a major problem for others, this isn't really the case for Gojo. Gojo is well aware of what Mahoraga can do and has plans in place to counter it when it's summoned. This is evident by him already knowing the history of the 10 Shadows technique and being confident about killing Mahoraga in a single attack. So even if Mahoraga is a massive trump card against many people in the series, against Gojo it's not as huge of an advantage in its base state. There's a brief flashback that goes back to Sukuna's battle with Yorozu. During his fight against Yorozu, Sukuna took many direct hits from Yorozu's bug armor. This was all done by Sukuna to take advantage of Mahoraga's wheel to adapt to Yorozu's curse technique, which let him pass that same adaptation to Mahoraga to destroy Yorozu's domain expansion in a single attack. The story then gives even more perspective on how many times Gojo and Sukuna have clashed over the course of their fight, saying that the domain expansion sure hit techniques have canceled each other out a total of 5 times. This once again highlights how the two are equals in terms of the raw strength of their domains, with the difference being the effect of their techniques on their targets in the battle of open versus closed domains, showing why Gojo and Sukuna are both the strongest of their respective eras, with no one else to challenge them but each other. Gojo's domain expansion is then expanded upon even further, giving more details on how it works. Gojo's domain expansion is said to target everything inside of the domain without exception. The only people shown to be protected from Unlimited Void's effects are those that Gojo chooses to protect with his own hands. Gojo obviously going for Sukuna makes Sukuna not a part of that exempt equation. Sukuna's domain expansion is slightly different, with conditions that aren't the same as Gojo's. Sukuna's domain expansion targets everything inside the domain except himself. This is best shown in Shibuya, when where Sukuna tries to exclude Megami, Sukuna shortened his domain's range instead of having a way to keep Megami safe in a spot where he could be affected. While their domains do work in different ways, this isn't all there is to what's happening. The sure hit effect that was targeting Sukuna was still in place. Sukuna continued to take on Unlimited Void 5 times throughout their fight, all while shouldering the burden of Mahoraga's adaptation. But the burden of Mahoraga's adaptation was actually on someone else entirely, showing that Sukuna using Mahoraga against Gojo was a part of Sukuna's plan from the very beginning. Back to the fight between Gojo and Sukuna. Gojo is in shock at the thought of Mahoraga having adapted so quickly, saying that there's no way that Mahoraga could have adapted in 1/100th of a second, since the wheel on Mahoraga's back didn't turn, and Mahoraga was only summoned after Sukuna was hit by Unlimited Void. In Sukuna's fight with Mahoraga in Shibuya, Mahoraga's adaptation was shown to activate after taking a single attack and having the wheel on its back turn, making Gojo correct in assuming that Mahoraga didn't adapt to Unlimited Void on its own. Gojo then begins to question what Sukuna's really capable of with the 10 Shadows, asking if Sukuna was able to take over adapting for Mahoraga himself. Although, as shown with Yorozu, this only happens when Sukuna summons Mahoraga's wheel over his own body. This was never shown at any point in Gojo's fight against Sukuna, so this isn't what's happening either. Gojo then realizes who the burden of taking his Unlimited Void has been placed on this entire time, realizing that the one who's been taking the damage to use Mahoraga's adaptation has been Megami's soul, in which Gojo can see both Megami and Sukuna's souls in Sukuna's body, with one being visibly bigger than the other. This proves that Gojo can see the soul, which has been speculated about all the way since Chapter 2, when Gojo first met Yuji and realized that Yuji and Sukuna combined. After realizing that Sukuna is hijacking Megami's soul to take damage for him to use Mahoraga's adaptation, Sukuna moves on, sending Mahoraga back into the shadows from where it came. Mahoraga was initially hyped up as being a major trump card against Limitless and Six Eyes, and in Sukuna's eyes, this seems to be as far as the Shikigami goes, not using it as a main part of the fight against Gojo in a 2 versus 1 match. Gojo then mocks Sukuna about even having to use Megami in the first place in a battle of the strongest, telling Sukuna that it warms his heart to see Sukuna so desperate. This is a lot like when Sukuna ran away from Yuji and Maki with the help of Uraume, as Sukuna isn't against using underhanded tactics to succeed. something that Gojo calls him out on repeatedly in the series. Sukuna then responds to Gojo and doesn't deny his claims, saying that unlimited void is an ability that attacks the brain, and he figured it would be a real pain to deal with. This highlights Sukuna's respect for Gojo as a strong opponent, even though some of his actions may show otherwise, as Sukuna does show admiration for those that he sees as worthy opponents, even if he does mock them in the process. Sukuna's knowledge of Gojo's domain expansion, Unlimited Void, goes all the way back to one of the earliest fights in the series. When facing Jogo, a special grade cursed spirit, Sukuna watched Gojo use his domain expansion firsthand. This is something that Sukuna was aware of due to him being able to access the memories of his vessel, Itadori Yuji, meaning that everything Yuji and now Megumi saw Gojo do over the years, Sukuna has seen as well. Even beyond seeing the domain itself, Sukuna saw firsthand how heavy the effects of Unlimited Void could be. Gojo's domain expansion flooded infinite sets of information into Jogo's mind, paralyzing him the entire time. This effect was something that basically fried Jogo's brain until the technique was over, and a process that Gojo described as being given everything and being able to do nothing, something that Sukuna absolutely took note of. Seeing how big of an effect Unlimited Void had on Jogo, Sukuna decided that the move had to be dealt with, choosing to take Unlimited Void out of the equation as the first thing for him to do. Sukuna being in a human body would be even more susceptible to Unlimited Void compared to Jogo, since the makeup of a human brain is more affected by Gojo's sure hit ability, showing how dangerous Gojo's domain expansion really is, even in the eyes of the King of Curses himself. Feeling he has everything under control, Sukuna explains his plan to Gojo even further, telling him that when he was unable to use domain amplification inside of Gojo's domain expansion, he had Megumi adapt to Unlimited Void using the 10 Shadows technique. The fact that Sukuna even had to go this far to begin with proves that what Shoko said was true, that if Gojo lands Unlimited Void on Sukuna uninterrupted, then he would win. As Sukuna having to place the burden of adaptation onto someone else means that he had no confidence in surviving the attack on his own. The conversation between Gojo and Sukuna also answers a major question that's been on many readers' minds, where Sukuna points out that because of him having Megumi adapt to Unlimited Void, he was unable to use any techniques other than Dismantle, Cleave, and Malevolent Shrine. This basically means that Sukuna was constantly having Megumi's soul use the 10 Shadows technique, so until Megumi finally adapted to Unlimited Void, the 10 Shadows was unavailable to Sukuna, giving him no way to access any of the 10 Shadows abilities while he waited for his plan to succeed. But Gojo realizes there's a flaw in Sukuna's plan. It isn't as foolproof as it seems. Megumi has only taken on the process of adaptation, not the resulting adaptation, so he isn't fully adapted to the technique. What Gojo is basically saying is that while Megumi is being used to activate Mahoraga's wheel, Sukuna himself isn't permanently immune to Unlimited Void's effects. So Gojo's curse technique is still effective for taking Sukuna down, and hasn't been totally negated just yet. Gojo then shows complete confidence in dealing with both Sukuna and Mahoraga, telling Sukuna that if Mahoraga is summoned inside of Unlimited Void for a second time, then he'll destroy it in a single attack. Gojo's plan to destroy Mahoraga likely being Hollow Purple, as that's the hand sign that he immediately made when Mahoraga was summoned for the first time, showing that even when sensing how much cursed energy Sukuna's Mahoraga has, he's still confident that Hollow Purple to the head will take Mahoraga down. Ready to take Sukuna to a 6th domain clash, Gojo readies his hand sign to use Unlimited Void, but Sukuna simply laughs, telling Gojo that his domain expansion can no longer be used. Sukuna is well aware of how much strain Gojo's been putting on himself, and knows that Gojo is reaching his limit. Knowing this, he has no reason to think that Gojo will use Unlimited Void again. Gojo isn't as healthy as he was before. The strain he's been putting on his body has finally caught up with him. Blood then starts gushing from his nose and pouring out of his mouth the second he tries to use his domain, showing that all of Yuta Kotsu's worrying about Gojo has been accurate up to this point. Gojo has been pushing himself far more than he's used to, and it's finally taken a toll on his body. Gojo has used reverse curse technique several times throughout the fight to heal his exhausted curse technique, and it's damaging him very heavily. Sukuna calls this out, saying that curse techniques are etched into the brain. This has been highlighted by both Mahito and Kenjaku when they adjusted Junpei and many others for sorcery, showing how important the brain is when it comes to Jujutsu sorcerers as a whole. What Gojo has been doing to recover his technique has now been brought to the surface. Sukuna calls out Gojo for destroying a piece of his own brain and then rebuilding it using reverse curse technique to refresh his own abilities. With Sukuna having copied this exact method for recovering burnt-out curse techniques from seeing Gojo do it, he would know about this better than anybody. This brings attention to how far Gojo will go to beat Sukuna, since he'll stop at nothing to see the job done. This brings up an important theme when it comes to Gojo's character. All the way back in chapter 58, Gojo told Megumi that winning by dying and winning even if you die are completely different things. Gojo being willing to destroy his own brain to defeat Sukuna is the perfect embodiment of this concept, especially with him doing this against someone who's possessing Megumi's body. It's a very nice touch by the author. This also gives even more of a reason why Satoru Gojo is the strongest of his generation, as no one is willing to risk as much as he is to win. This is illustrated by Yuta Kotsu, the sorcerer who stands directly beneath Gojo, seeing what Gojo is doing and having no idea what's happening. Yuta having no idea how Gojo is doing this shows another reason why the gap between them exists, because Yuta has clearly never been willing to do something on that level to succeed, with the closest example being ending himself to win, which is the opposite of what Gojo's demonstrating. Yuta's initial idea of what Gojo was doing didn't fully grasp how healing exhausted abilities work. His first instinct was to compare it to the process of healing the body, comparing curse techniques to an engine that overheats rather than a body that gets physically damaged. What Gojo has basically been doing is destroying that engine and rebuilding it in real time to have it work again, something that goes beyond anything that Yuta ever imagined doing himself. While everyone around him is in shock at what Gojo's been doing to stay in the fight, Kusakabe makes an observation, saying that the part of the curse technique where the brain is located is a black box, and that simply healing it isn't as simple as it may seem. Black box in this context comes from a computer term, which basically means an unknown. This shows that not only do others not think about taking the kind of risk that Gojo does, they don't even understand that part of the brain enough to consider taking them, highlighting Gojo's intelligence and how far he's willing to go to win. Black boxes in Jujutsu Kaisen have been a topic entirely in themselves. Going back to chapter 115, Sukuna fought the special grade disaster curse Jogo, where he called on a mysterious black box and said open. This let Sukuna use a flame technique that no one knew he had access to at the time, and has remained a mystery ever since. What this may be hinting at is that Sukuna may have been opening this part of his brain in a way that others aren't familiar with to access different abilities. Gojo pushing himself to this degree is put into perspective even more by Choso. Choso speaks, saying that with the amount of times that Gojo has done this to himself, he should be at death's door. Gojo has destroyed his brain 5 times in the fight against Sukuna, on top of expanding his domain every time as well. This is also on top of the fact that Gojo's 6 eyes being uncovered for this long exhaust him even with reverse curse technique. At this point in the fight, Gojo has likely pushed himself to a level that would have killed others a long time ago. While Gojo is being pushed to his limits, Shoko interjects, as she's seen hints that this could happen to him before, saying that Gojo had become used to healing his brain, but he's now suffering the consequences of his actions. As from the moment that Gojo began using more than one domain expansion and healing his abilities, the rest of the sorcerers have been on the edge of their seats, wondering if he'd be able to keep up that kind of pace. Gojo is in a completely different situation than he was before now, and he's now losing his footing against Sukuna for the first time. Shoko's comments about thinking Gojo is used to healing his brain do have merit to them, as all the way back in the Hidden Inventory arc after the death of Toji, Gojo learned a reverse curse technique and has been healing his brain non-stop for over a decade, to avoid his brain being fried even happening. Although what Gojo has been doing in this case takes things to a completely different level. This isn't simply healing the brain. This is destroying a piece of the brain, regenerating it, and pushing himself past every limit that he has. Although Sukuna isn't exempt to this either, but it hasn't put him in as much danger as Gojo. Gojo has destroyed and rebuilt himself 5 times in a single fight, while Sukuna has done the same, but not in an equal amount. Sukuna copied the entire idea from seeing Gojo do it in the first place. So naturally, Gojo has done it more times, leading to Gojo being in worse shape than Sukuna overall. Gojo falls to one knee in front of Sukuna, who gloats at the idea of Gojo's weakened state. Sukuna voices that Gojo reached a completely different limit from healing flesh and bone, and even if he could use his domain expansion again, he would die the second that he did. Sukuna also mentions that even if Gojo could use his domain expansion, then he wouldn't be nearly as precise as he would need to be to oppose Sukuna, to which Gojo has no response. This proves that Gojo expanding his domain 5 times and refreshing his technique that same amount of times has taken him to the limit of how far that can go until he shows otherwise. Even with all this, Sukuna isn't finished, as he now plans on using his strongest moves while Gojo is in this weakened state. He explains to Gojo that he'll no longer keep his domain open and will close it to give Gojo nowhere to run. This stops Gojo from leaving Sukuna's domain with something like teleportation or any other means, as he would be trapped with Sukuna inside of Malevolent Shrine the entire time. This would be completely different from any of their other clashes, since Gojo using Unlimited Void would be completely off the table, leaving him with only the basics against Sukuna's full set of abilities. Sukuna is now ready to use everything that he has against Gojo, as he readies himself to fight Satoru once again, placing Mahoraga's wheel on top of himself as he plans to adapt to Gojo's infinity along the way. This is the same strategy of adapting the techniques that he used against Yorozu, to pass on to Mahoraga later, with Sukuna's plan in this moment likely being the exact same thing, but with far more pressure onto Gojo. As Gojo has fallen to one knee, Sukuna gloats before he gets ready to turn up the pressure on Gojo in their fight, speaking down to Gojo, saying that he was born in an era where Sukuna didn't exist and was hailed as the strongest, yet he turned out to be painfully ordinary, which is a bit hypocritical considering he almost died a few minutes before this was said. Regardless, Sukuna has the upper hand now, and the fight is flowing in his direction. Ready to pour all the pressure onto Gojo, Sukuna uses his domain expansion, Malevolent Shrine. Sukuna's Malevolent Shrine then shatters before it can take effect, with the entire shrine falling apart around him. Not only has Gojo been taken to his limit, but Sukuna has been pushed to his limits as well, as neither one of them can use domain expansion for the rest of the fight. Even though he passed the burden of adapting Megumi's soul, Sukuna didn't fully escape from Unlimited Void. The time that Sukuna was affected by Gojo's domain was less than 10 seconds in total. This is impressive because all the way back in Shibuya, regular humans were hit for a total of 0.2 of a second and were flooded with half a year worth of information and put in a coma for 2 months straight, with Jogo being inside of Gojo's domain for over a minute if you count the anime's runtime. Human brains are more vulnerable to Unlimited Void's effects, so based on Gojo's domain expansion in Shibuya, Sukuna was hit with 25 years worth of information being injected into his brain at the absolute most, and was still able to function afterward. Even though Sukuna can still talk and use Mahoraga's wheel, he isn't unaffected by Gojo's Unlimited Void. Gojo's domain is noted to have damaged Sukuna's brain to the point where he can no longer use his domain expansion. This is on top of him using reverse curse technique to heal his own abilities after copying Gojo in their fight. And the damage to Sukuna's brain is shown to be too much for him to use Malevolent Shrine. Gojo then regains his confidence, seeing that Sukuna is reaching the same limit that he is, telling Sukuna that his students are watching, so he's going to keep showing off. This ties back to the first fight between Gojo and Sukuna, where he tested Sukuna, watched by Megumi, and now aims to destroy Sukuna to save Megumi from his clutches, giving all of Gojo's students more hope that he's going to win. Gojo now has everything that he needs to keep fighting Sukuna and goes straight for the win, pulling Sukuna into him using blue and nailing him with a punch to the face. Blue has been pointed out by Gojo to have magnetic properties all the way back in hidden inventory, with this being a very effective way to use that kind of technique in a fight. Sukuna then has yet another reminder of Yorozu's words, the Heian era sorcerer from the past that he killed to gain control over Megumi, where she speaks to him about the loneliness that comes with unrivaled strength, and how she aimed to teach him about love. Sukuna and Gojo, as the strongest of their respective generations, are the only ones who understand what that loneliness truly means, making them the perfect opponents for one another as the strongest of the past versus the strongest of today. All of this illustrates the theme that's played through the series between both Gojo and Sukuna. Gojo experienced loneliness after Suguru went rogue, due to having no one else who could understand him at his level of strength. The same way that Sukuna was unrivaled through the Heian era, with no one that truly understood what it was like to be at that level either. This fight will give both Gojo and Sukuna the kind of battle they've probably been craving for their entire lives. Someone who can push them to the very end, when both of them are using everything that they have. This does bring a major question into the fight, as Yorozu's gift has still yet to come into play. All the way back in chapter 219, Yorozu used her construction technique to craft something for Sukuna, giving him this gift with her dying breath, saying to think of this item as being herself. What this gift even is has yet to come into play, and Sukuna has shown that he's not against using the abilities of others to fight Gojo, bringing out the question of what Yorozu's gift even is and when will it come into play.